Every once in a while, I feel compelled to qualify my fandom for certain bands. So, you like Pink Floyd? I do like Pink Floyd, but mainly the Syd Barrett recordings. Fleetwood Mac? Yes, but mostly just the Peter Green records. Chicago? In direct proportion to the amount of Terry Kath? Or in inverse proportion to the amount of Peter Cetera? But the band with the biggest asterisk in my life is Genesis. Has been for many years. When Genesis released the album And Then There Were Three, I was only 8 years old. There was never a time in my childhood memory in which Genesis was not a radio-friendly, soft-ish rock group. Songs like Follow You, Follow Me, Misunderstanding, No Reply at All, That's All, Invisible Touch. These were part of the pop and rock radio and MTV background for all of my childhood. The Genesis I heard as a kid didn't spark much excitement for me. Mostly. Abacab and Turn It On Again. Those were pretty cool, I thought. Oh yeah, and the video for Land of Confusion, the one with all the puppets. To me, at that time, Genesis was Phil Collins' rock band before he started doing soundtracks and ballads. At one point in my teens, I do remember discussing Genesis with my dad. I remember Butch telling me that they used to be really freaking weird. They used to dress in ornate bulbous costumes and play 20-minute semi-classical experimental art pieces. And I don't know that I knew how to handle that information at the time. I mean, I couldn't really square his description as being the same band that recorded Although I Need You, I'm Not Gonna Leave This Too Deep. But when I started heavily exploring the music in my mom's record collection in my late teens, I do remember finding her promo copy of Trespass. I remember reading the album credits and coming away a little surprised. Not only was there no Phil Collins on this album, but the singer was, Peter Gabriel? You mean like Sledgehammer, Big Time, Shock the Monkey? That Peter Gabriel? It only took me a spin or two of Trespass for me to become a fan. The songs were all like 8 to 10 minutes long, and each was like a short fantasy story. The music was much more complicated and harmonically interesting than anything I'd heard from Genesis so far, with stronger emphasis on acoustic guitars and organs when compared to the synth-heavy Genesis I'd heard so far. And so for the next few years, I would seek out Genesis albums with Peter Gabriel and pick them up when I could. And in that way, I came to know Nursery Crimes, Selling England by the Pound, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and especially Foxtrot. I love Foxtrot. In my brain, Genesis became two different bands. One was the softer, safer, more adult contemporary Genesis of my childhood. The other was the more ornate symphonic Genesis of my increasingly eclectic musical collection. To help clarify things going forward, I'll refer to these two different bands as Radio Genesis and Early Genesis. But what about A Trick of the Tail, I hear some of you say? It's a good question. I actually didn't hear that one until later in life. And when I finally did, I liked it quite a bit. So that leaves just two albums in Genesis' catalog unexplored for me. Their first album from 1969 called From Genesis to Revelations, which I have been repeatedly warned against. And then 1976's Wind and Wuthering.
Wind and Wuthering was the 8th Genesis album and the first one to be recorded outside the UK. It was recorded in the Netherlands. I think for a lot of folks, this is a companion album to A Trick of the Tail. They were both done by the same lineup, the era after Peter Gabriel departed and before Steve Hackett left. This is really their last progressive rock-themed record. After that, they went in a decidedly commercial direction with shorter songs, no epics or any big tunes at all, called And Then There Were Three.
At first, what I'm hearing is a lot similar to the sonic palette of A Trick of the Tail. The keyboard choices, the guitar tones, the balance and polish of the band. It all has the more refined sound of tunes like Ripples and Robbery, Assault and Battery. But the mood is different. The emotional space in which Wind and Wuthering resides has elements of introspection, nostalgia, weariness, longing, and regret, making it more in line with tunes like Timetable from Foxtrot or Dusk from Trespass. Subdued and unself-conscious. Mostly. There are a couple of pretty blaring exceptions. The instrumental What Gorilla is the most fusion thing I've ever heard on any Genesis album. Not too surprising it should show up here, though. After all, Phil Collins' fusion band Brand X had just recorded their first album, Unorthodox Behavior, just a few months prior to Wind Wuthering. Unorthodox Behavior rules.
The opening track, The 11th Earl of Mar, is without a doubt one of Genesis' best epics. It's got a middle section written by Steve Hackett, and the remainder around it is written by Tony Banks. Originally, it was intended to be two different songs. Here's an interesting fact. The 8-string bass was in vogue in 1977. Progressive rock brethren Greg Lake, Chris Squire, and even John Paul Jones were using it to great effect on the records they made that year. Mike Rutherford did as well, and uses it on the opening track.
A couple of other things I'm noticing. One from The Vine, amazing tune, absolutely beautiful laconic chord choices. Then at the beginning of the instrumental section, there's suddenly duck calls. Not sure that's the choice I would have made, but okay.
I think many can agree that one of the greatest Genesis epics was One for the Vine, and it's also maybe Tony Banks' peak as a writer in that style. He'd never really write another Genesis song with this sort of epic scope. If you recall a song called Mad Man Moon from Trick of the Tail, I would say that this song is its big brother. Couple that with some of Steve Hackett's best contributions, or cake icing, if you would. And you get one of the greatest epics in the Genesis catalog. Really one of the last. I could point to Duke's Travels, Duke's End as maybe the last epic. But this is the last one that's in the style that came prior.
The classical guitar intro to Blood on the Rooftops is gorgeous.
Written by Steve Hackett. I think anyone that's heard Steve Hackett play nylon string guitar knows that he had the chops to be a serious classical guitarist had he chosen to take that route. And I think Blood on the Rooftops is a fine example of that style that he does so well.
The slice of life references in the song's lyrics make it feel, for me, a bit like a prog rock reimagining of the Beatles' Good Morning, Good Morning. Very British middle class. But, and this might get me in trouble, it was listening to the song Your Own Special Way that started to change things for me in pretty fundamental ways. I know from the research that I've done that many fans of progressive rock tend to see Your Own Special Way as the track from this album that they'd rather not discuss. But I feel I need to. Like it or not, there's a lot to discuss here.
A tune that is hotly contested by their progressive rock fan base. It helped pave the way for U.S. chart success. It reached number 62.
The opening of the song feels very much in line with early Genesis, right? Organic sounding, acoustic guitars and keyboards. In waltz time, inventive harmonies over simple chords, simultaneously quiet and dense. But suddenly, against all odds, the chorus starts out and we're in full Phil Collins radio ballad land. I see what you did there, but Mike Rutherford wrote Your Own Special Way, not Phil Collins. Huh. Good to know. It sounds to me like early Genesis is playing the verses and Radio Genesis is playing the choruses, but it all still feels like parts of the same song. And that unified the band for me. Just like that, I was finally able to envision the unbroken chain which goes from Trespass to Invisible Touch. And those elements I identified in Your Own Special Way as belonging to Radio Genesis, I started hearing echoes of those same elements in most of the rest of the album, especially Blood on the Rooftops, Afterglow, and then the two instrumental tracks that immediately precede it. This kind of revelation has only happened for me once before. Bare Trees is an album my mom used to play a lot when I was but a wee young thing, but one I hadn't listened to critically until I was in my 40s. In Bare Trees, I was able to hear the blues, bass, and the swagger of the Peter Green era albums, but also the slick aloofness and polish of the Lindsey Buckingham era. All in the same recording. The same kind of stylistic bridging of different eras. I hear that in Wind Wuthering. And the album covers are similar too. That's true. You guys, I think the research for these albums might be my undoing. It started simply enough. I wondered whether the word wuthering from the title was a reference to Wuthering Heights. Turns out it is. In fact, two of the song titles combine to directly quote the last line of the book. I lingered round them under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and the harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth. So I read Wuthering Heights. After a bit more research, I found that The Flight of the Heron by D.K. Broster was the source material used for the opening track, The 11th Earl of Mar. Also, the song One from the Vine was inspired by the fantasy novel Phoenix in Obsidian by Michael Moorcock. Nice. Good thing I like reading, I guess. Though I will stop short of reading the entire Eternal Champion series. So, now that I've read these 3 books for this one album, the question is, did it help? What does a knowledge of those works contribute when listening to Wind and Wuthering? Honestly, mostly the weather. I'm not trying to be overly glib here. After spending some literary time in the North Country moors, in the Scottish lowlands, and the cold isolation of Roanoke, the aspects of these environments that I heard reflected in Wind and Wuthering are largely those having to do with the weather. Okay, to be completely fair, the song Afterglow definitely has new meaning for me after reading Wuthering Heights. And I did benefit from a knowledge of the life of Bobbing John Erskine and the Jacobites when listening to the 11th Earl of Mar. But those are the exceptions. By contrast, every single vocal track on Wind and Wuthering mentions the weather in some sense. Weather is the thread that ties the entire album together. I even heard one documentary filmmaker refer to Wind and Wuthering as autumnal, and I think that fits.
I've heard it said many times that this album evokes autumn. For me, I actually think it evokes winter. And I think Trick of the Tail evokes autumn with its kind of autumn color scheme here, the browns and the golds. Whereas I think Wind and Wuthering has more of a wintry, frosty vibe to it. Just my 2 cents.
And if you'll excuse my rather clumsy metaphor here, it was a change in the weather for rock and roll music as a whole that started happening in 1976 that gives me the most respect for this album and for Genesis. Because in December of 1976, the Sex Pistols appeared on The Bill Grundy Show, a UK interview program.
Opposed to their anti-materialistic view of life?
More the merrier.
I don't suppose it would come as any surprise to anyone that it caused quite the stir at the time. Quite the scandal. That interview had the effect of making the Sex Pistols famous in the UK even before the release of their first album. But that interview had other effects as well. Performing musicians in the UK saw this as a herald that much of British rock was now becoming obsolete. Be it blues rock, British Invasion, folk rock, but especially prog. But less than 2 weeks after the Grundy interview, Genesis released Wind and Wuthering, an album that contains a 6-minute prog epic about the nightly exploits of a mouse. And no self-consciousness, no snark, just here's some music we made. I respect that. Genesis made music of their heart, and they released it even as the winds of music were changing around them. And as it would happen, Genesis was right on the brink of some major changes as well. Right after Wind and Wuthering, they would gain Chester Thompson to play drums for live shows, allowing Phil Collins to be their frontman. And less than a year later, they would lose Steve Hackett.
And there's a few reasons why he decided to leave after this record. Mainly being he had written a lot of material that he felt needed to be part of the Genesis albums, and he was getting overlooked in favor of Tony Banks. So he went and did a solo album called Voyage of the Acolyte. Here. Which turned out to be a fantastic solo record. It also featured Phil Collins and Mike Rutherford as his rhythm section. And there's some classic Hackett moments there that could have easily fit on a Genesis record, but didn't make the cut.
Final analysis, the music of this album sticks with me. Even after a dozen or more listens, my brain is still processing, trying to pull apart all the interesting little moments. This is a good thing. Also, interestingly enough, Wind and Wuthering has made me want to revisit the early 80s Genesis catalog, especially Duke and Abacab. I think I might have developed a new appreciation for that era of their music.
So in a way, this is a transitional album that is really rather special. And in some ways, I think is a culmination of where they were heading for the past 3 or 4 records.